We're lucky enough to be joined by a diverse group of authors today. They're diverse in their identities and backgrounds, as well as the range of texts that they write, the topics that they explore, and even the formats of their books. Author illustrator Greg Pizzoli, his picture books and graphic novels are largely playful. He introduces us to race car driving dogs, generally lovable book hogs, and even a pictorial history of pizza. In her Newbery Honor Award-winning book, The Night Diary, and her 2024 book, Amil and the After, author Veera Hiranandani unpacks the notions of home, identity, and overcoming adversity in her middle grade books. And finally, Olugbemisola Rhuday-Perkovich has married her lifelong passions of youth development and education and public service into a robust career as an author. So we're going to have the chance to hear from each author individually before we open up for a larger panel. So I'm going to invite Greg to come tell us a little bit about his literacy lifeline, his story of growing up as a reader, as well as his story into becoming an author, and what he hopes readers and those who work with his books will take from his books. So he will tell his story, and then I'll pose a specific question to Greg.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Molly, for that nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're enjoying your lunch. Thanks to the Penguin Random House Education team and the Knopf team for having me here today. What do you think? Do I need both of these microphones on or just one? We're going both. Happy to be here with you all. Thank you to my colleagues. Looking forward to a lively conversation with you all. So yeah, my name is Greg Pizzoli, and I make books. I have published 15 books that I've written and illustrated. And I've illustrated another 20 to 25, somewhere around there, where I've done the pictures, but not the words. So I'm often introduced as an author and an illustrator, but I have really over the years started to think of myself as just a bookmaker. I studied book arts and printmaking at the University of the Arts 15 years ago when I got my MFA. And I have always, even as a kid, loved making books, physical books, like printed real ink on with real paper books. And when I get an idea for a project, it almost always takes the form of a book. I think that since 2011, with the exception of my wife and 2 daughters, has kind of been the thing that I am obsessed with my whole life. But especially since 2011, that was so that in and of itself is not unusual, right? There's a lot of book lovers in here. Anybody in here love books? Are there any book lovers in here? Some people are fans of reading, I would imagine. But as it turns out, the kind of books that I make and love to make are kind of specific. And I tend to make early readers, which can kind of be a sort of a tricky term. You know, early reader, quote unquote, connotes a specific trim size and page length and word count. And oftentimes a rote sort of circular style of storytelling that I don't always like that much. But basically what I mean when I say early readers is I'm making books for kids who are transitioning from reading with someone else to reading on their own. And if I'm totally honest, I sort of fell into that by accident, my love of early readers. My very first book that I had published is this one up here on the right, The Watermelon Seed. And I heard after that book came out in 2013, I heard from a lot of parents, a lot of teachers, a lot of kids that this was the first book that they read. I heard from a lot of 4-year-olds that it was the first book that they ever read, kids who couldn't read. But it is only 140 words long, and a lot of the words repeat, and they memorized it, you know? And so they had that feeling of accomplishment that they had read a book even before they could read. And so I sort of took that experience of talking to kids and teachers and librarians after making the watermelon seed, and it sort of shaped the direction that I've been going in my career since then. You know, that moment when reading goes from an activity in which you're passive, if interested, but you're a passive observer, to when you're actually reading it yourself, I think is a really magical moment. And I remember books from my own childhood that were sort of the first moments for me where I felt like I was doing the reading, I was in control of it. So I think it's really important that kids get books that are interesting and funny, and perhaps most importantly to me, honest. You know, so many books, I'd say, especially early readers, tend to tell kids how to behave, how to act, how to navigate the world in a way that's very expected. And it's been my role as a creator, at least the way I've seen it, is to make books that make kids feel smart, help them feel accomplished, and to make them laugh. So I think the danger is that if we make books for kids, if they're too heavy-handed, if they're too sort of laid up in sentimentality, or maybe even high-minded, have a big feeling of how important they are, we may scare or bore those kids away, and we might never get them back. You know, we lose them to things that are easier, shinier, iPads, Minecraft, Roblox, and we don't get them back. You know, so if we are making the case that books are important and books are entertaining and books are vital, which I'm sure as a room full of book lovers we all do, we all feel that way, we all know that to be true, we have to make certain that the books we are creating and sharing with those kids are worth their time, worth their effort. You know, learning how to read can be really hard, but it can also be really fun. So the books that stuck with me all the way from my childhood to today, I actually had my childhood copies of these books in a tote bag that is somewhere next to my front door in my house in Philadelphia. But the three books I wanted to bring were The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar and Six More by Roald Dahl, Owl at Home by Arnold Lobel, and Henry's Awful Mistake by Robert Quackenbush. So many other books, but those three in particular were the ones that I had set aside. And they were all good at this. They all spoke to me very directly and honestly. They hit me sort of right where I was at the moment when I read them. They didn't talk down to me. They didn't sort of inflate themselves. And perhaps more than anything, they were mine. They weren't books that had a sort of a ham-fisted moral message. They weren't something I had to read for school. They weren't books that my mom bought me because she thought I should, you know, learn more about plants or something. They were stories and characters that I thought were funny and interesting. And all three of those books had a commonality in that they made me feel smart because I, as a reader, knew something that the main character didn't yet know. So that's been my goal. You know, you can up for debate as to how successful I've been. Your mileage may vary, but that is what I'm shooting for, that kind of feeling. So as an example of how that kind of thing can manifest itself in my own work, you all have a copy of Lucky Duck supplied. Thank you to Penguin Random House. Thank you for doing that. And, you know, this book is, Lucky Duck is about Susan the Duck and the wolf who is trying to eat her. And it's about a mean antagonist character who the kids who are reading it, kids in the audience, will immediately suspect. And a flawed but very charming protagonist who the kids who are reading it will immediately and instinctively protect, right? And so it's also about sometimes how in life sometimes when everything is going wrong, a lot of bad things are happening, that's when you realize how lucky you are. So as you look through and read Lucky Duck, look for the friendly little yellow cockroach who helps Susan throughout the story. He's never mentioned in the text, never called out in the words, but is sort of what Maurice Sendak called the other story. That's like my attempt at adding another layer of storytelling just through the pictures. So that's my book that you all have. And I will mention that next year I have a new early reader series. It's my first proper early reader. A lot of my picture books get called early readers, but next year, Earl and Worm is a new early reader series. It's about Earl E. Bird and his best friend Worm, who is a worm. And the first 3 books of that series will come out next year. And you can all sign up for updates on that at the Penguin Random House site or my Substack newsletter. And again, I feel very lucky to be here with you all today. And I look forward to chatting more. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up, we will hear from Veera, who is the author of Newbery Honor Award-winning The Night Diary. She earned her MFA in creative writing at Sarah Lawrence College. She's the author of The Whole Story of a Half a Girl, a Sydney Taylor notable book, and a South Asia Book Award finalist, as well as How to Find What You're Not Looking For, winner of the Sydney Taylor Book Award and New York Historical Society Children's Book Prize. She's a former editor at Simon & Schuster, and she now teaches writing for children and young adults at the MFA program at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. So Veera is here to tell her story, and I'm hoping that she will also talk a bit about much of her writing that focuses on growing up in 2 cultures and how that experience impacted her identity and writing development.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I'm just happy to be here with all of you today. And thank you to Penguin Random House. So I wanted to start with thinking about how I really fell in love with books. And I think it'll incorporate all of those themes. So my most recent book is Amil in the After, which is a continuation of the story that I started in The Night Diary. But the Night Diary focused on Nisha and her diary, writing about what happened during the partition of India and how her family had to leave their home, which is loosely based on some of the experiences my father had when he had to leave his home during the partition. And she has a twin brother, Amil. And so Amil in the After focuses on his story after they experience their displacement and they start to rebuild their lives. And so we focus on his point of view. But I was thinking about, why I became a writer in the first place and why I fell in love with reading and writing. And this isn't always the typical story of any writer, right? We all come to reading and writing in different ways at different ages. I definitely was kind of that classic creative kid who always loved to write and make up stories and write poetry and draw and paint. And that was a way I needed to express myself. And I loved reading and I came to it pretty early. I was never sort of, somebody who kind of felt like a block with reading. I needed those creative spaces. And I think part of what happened was I went to a very small school. It was a private school. It was an arts-based school that in the 70s that some of my parents' friends were part of creating, and some of them were teachers at the school. And it was really like an extended family. And I went there from first to fourth grade. There were 50 kids in this entire school and about 8 kids in my class that we went from year to year to year. It was a very unique experience, and all of our lessons were tied into some kind of art project, whether it was painting, sculpture, writing, poetry, whatever we were doing. We were learning everything through the lens of art. And then one day, the school didn't have enough kids to fill the 5th grade. And so I went to my town's public school in Connecticut, and it was such a culture shock for me. And I felt so different in so many different ways. Not only I just didn't know how to be a student in a big public school and like walk in line and call my teachers by their last names and do all of these things that I never did before. And also it was the first time that my identity kind of came in play. And I was asked questions about, how I could have 2 religions in my family. My mother is Jewish and was born in the New York area. My father is originally from India and came here and met my mom, Indian Hindu. So that's my background. And in the small town in Connecticut, there were very few kids that had either background, let alone both. So in this new public school, I felt just separate in a lot of, and other, and kind of a lot of different ways. And so I really turned more than I ever had to writing and reading. And so the books that I fell in love with were the characters in those books were my friends until I made new friends. And I started writing in a diary. And I really kept a diary, different diaries from that age on through college. And so that's part of why I chose the diary format for the night diary, because I'm very familiar with that. But I was thinking about those books that I read on my own, not in school, that I just discovered on my own, and how they really got me through this difficult time when then eventually I got used to it and I made friends. But I was thinking of these themes that I think participated in my love, falling in love with books. And I think those 4 themes were that I had agency. I could choose what I wanted to read because I was lucky that I had a lot of books around in my house. I had older cousins. We would get these boxes of, old books that they had been through, and I could kind of search through, go to the library. There were books everywhere. And so I felt like I was free to choose whatever kind of excited me in the moment. So that was agency. And then when I really connected to the book, I felt this really rich connection to the characters where I could kind of live their lives or see some of my own experiences reflected back to me. So there was this real connection that I was feeling that I wasn't getting in my real life at that time. So I had the agency to choose. I had that connection. And then through that connection, I really felt like I felt independent. It gave me a sense of independence that I could find that for myself, that I wasn't just dependent on the adults in my world to kind of give that to me. And then through that independence, I felt empowered. So it was this agency, connection, independence, and empowerment. And all of those things, I think, when I was thinking about this, are themes in all of my books, whether the kids are big readers or not in my books. And all of my books tend to focus on kids who have some kind of learning difference, because that's just something else that I've experienced in my life as a parent. And so I think about Amil in the After, and I think about he's a kid who they've had to leave their home during the partition of India, and he's trying to rebuild his life with his family. He feels very at the mercy of kind of this adult world that he doesn't fully understand. He doesn't know why things have happened the way they've happened. He also, it's not labeled in the book, but he has dyslexia. So reading and writing is really hard for him. But he wants to make sense of his world, and he's a creative person. And so he really comes to drawing, actually, in a way that he can process his world and kind of make sense of it. But it gives him all those things. When he loses himself in his drawing journal, which we see in the book, he has that agency to draw whatever he wants. And then he's like making sense and making connections in his world. And then he feels more independent that way. And then he's more empowered. So the drawing kind of gives him that way to make story. And then hopefully I'm not spoiling it, but he and Nisha at one point collaborate where she's writing and he's drawing. But I think whether a kid is a big reader or not, or maybe has certain difficulties with reading, it is really about that, whatever book they fall in love with, it's giving them that space for the agency and the connection and the independence and the empowerment. And as educators, to have that space too, right? To kind of make that space for your students in their classroom. So I think those themes are definitely, part of all of my stories, and kids kind of finding those spaces, and whether falling in love with some kind of making of story or creative space in their life, that's all theirs. So that's why and how I fell in love with books. Thank you.
And finally, welcome to Olugbemisola Rhuday-Perkovich. She is the author of the titles that you see, as well as some nonfiction books, Above and Beyond, NASA's Journey to Tomorrow, and the upcoming May Makes a Way and Saving Earth, the Climate Crisis and Fight for Our Future. She's the co-author of she's the co-author of middle grade novels, Two Naomis, which was nominated for an NAACP Image Award and its sequel, Naomi's 2. Inspired by some of her favorite family stories in the city she loves, Operation Sisterhood, which you see there, is a celebration of the sweetness and spice of sisterhood. She's a member of the Brown Bookshelf and a former board member of We Need Diverse Books. She lives with her family here in the city where she writes, makes things, and like many of us probably can relate, needs to get more sleep. So we're here to hear her story as well as her experience as an anthology editor and how anthologies are valuable resources for readers, especially those who are reluctant or struggling.
Thank you, and yay, I get to be the closer. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us and for allowing us to join you. And thank you, Random House and Crown, and just everyone I love these kinds of conversations and discussions. So it's really exciting for me. I am definitely a nerd, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've always been a nerd. I was what some of my friends even called a school nerd. And it was because of books. So I grew up really being nourished by stories, by the stories that my parents and my family members would tell about back home. My parents were both immigrants from Jamaica and Nigeria. And so my little sister and I were always like, tell us about when you were little. Tell us about what it was like coming to New York. Tell us, and like over and over. So we would have stories at bedtime, stories around the dinner table, stories that were not maybe being told to us, but that we would eavesdrop and overhear. And like Veera, I was what I call a free range reader. So we always had a lot of literature in the home, books, magazines, newspapers. There was a lot of print matter in the home, and I felt like I had access to it. And I would read a lot of things I didn't understand. I would read things over and over and over again. And I was a very shy kid, and we moved a lot. So we moved for every grade up until I was in 8th grade. And sometimes it was in different countries, and I went to a lot of very different types of schools. So small schools, public schools, private schools, what we used to call crunchy schools. So it's like a lot of different types of communities. And as a shy child, part of what I think helped me develop as a writer was that I had to pay attention. So each community I was coming in, I had to just sort of spend some time understanding what was going on and understanding the community, trying to figure out who I was going to be friends with, trying to figure out what were the things I should wear and do. And I would take notes, the literal notes, and I would go home. And like Vera, I had a lot of journals. I still have some of them. And I would make notes about what I saw. And then I would use my books to help me figure out how I was going to be in the world. And I always think when I'm working with students, I talk about how that's just one of the many benefits of reading, one of the joys of reading, so that they can be that space to work out how you think, to work out who you are, who you want to be, who you aren't, and to have opportunities to explore your identity. And then, like with an anthology, like with The Hero Next Door, like use it as a way to connect with other readers and other people. And one of the great things about working on Hero Next Door is that, we took a theme about everyday heroes, and then all of the writers and artists did something so different with that theme. And it helps me talk to students about how each of our stories is precious. Every single one of our stories is precious. So I can say to them, your story is powerful. Your story is your own. And it's also a way to connect with others. And I think it's so important that what I had as a young reader and as a young writer was the sense from my family and from the educators and the librarians around me was that all the little stories and all the little things I wrote were valuable, that my choices were respected. I was not allowed to watch very much TV as a kid, so it was an hour a week of PBS. And so I would go to school and hear my friends talk about the shows that they watch. And I would be like, yeah, that was good. And I didn't know what they were talking about. But I would go home and make little books for my little sister about what I heard. And so I would start sort of making up stories and drawing. And then so my family saw what I was doing. And so then I had access to paper and markers and just materials and always. So that was a big thing. We went to the library all the time and I could just take out, it was such a treat to me because again, I was a nerd to just take this big stack of books and I could pick whatever I wanted. And my parents were slick because I could pick whatever I wanted, but then they would also make recommendations. And because they respected the choices that I had made, I respected their recommendations. And so I talk a lot at schools about that give and take and that back and forth and that mutual respect can make such a difference between sort of being like, this is, which I used to hate to hear as a kid, like, this is a good book you have to read, versus like I'll ask kids like, well, what do you recommend? So now you know a little bit about me. What do you think I should read? What do you like now? What are you reading now? And it's really interesting to hear and to have those conversations, and sometimes to debate and say like, oh, I read that. I didn't really connect with that. Why did you connect with it? So I use both my own books and just books in general, literacy in general, to talk in those ways with young readers. And then for writers, a lot of times I'll meet students who'll say like, oh, I'm not a writer. I don't like writing or I don't like reading. And again, I go back to everyone has a story. Everyone's story is valuable. Everyone's story is precious. And that there are many different ways to tell a story. One of the fun parts of writing Operation Sisterhood was that I kind of took that joy that I had as a young reader, as a young writer, and about school, and tried to put that in the story as an example of how learning can be joyful, how it can be fun when you have, as Veera said, agency over it, and when it comes through relationships, when it comes through story, when it's not coming through sort of mandates. And then students who might say like, I like to draw, I'm like, that's a way of telling story. So if you like comic books, you like graphic novels, those have value, just as much value as novels. Listening to audiobooks. As a kid, I used to hear my grandparents listen to this old, I guess they still have it, 1010 Wins News. And like, I can remember over and over, like, you give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world. And just listening to the news and like, but listening to stories that way. And as a parent, that was one of the first ways, because after my own experience, my daughter was also not allowed to watch very much television, but we listened to a lot of audiobooks together. And learning how to listen to stories that way, I have arguments sometimes with other parents about whether or not that's really reading or whether or not that's valuable. And I could brag about my daughter and how proud I am of her and everything she's done but she's a lover of story. She's a writer, she's a reader. And I think learning how to listen to stories, learning how to communicate through different ways of telling stories is such a valuable thing and such a way that we can use books, that we can use film, that we can meet students wherever they are and then share where we are and how we got to where we are, to celebrate stories and to make books and literacy, reading and writing joyful things in the world. Thank you.
So I've got some questions that I hope all three of you will be able to touch on in some capacity. So I started out this morning with a little bit of the gloom and doom of the data showing that reading for pleasure has been on the decline with children and teens. So I'm hoping that you can comment on how the attendees in this room, be it their role in classrooms or schools or homes, how we can address that and what we can do about increasing reading for pleasure.
I just talked. So. Okay, I'll talk. One of the things I think is just doing it together, reading together, or talking about what you're reading, talking about what you want to read, being excited about reading, and talking about it as a joyful thing, not as something that's good for you, like as medicine, not as something that you have to do, not even as something that's like good for you for college or for the future, just like something that's good for life, that's enjoyable, that's enriching. I think that's important. And making it fun. I love doing lunch book clubs, like at schools and libraries or after school book clubs. We always have food. There are not too many rules. And there are opportunities to relax with books and just sort of be ourselves and talk about ourselves through story.
Yeah, it's so important to find that joy and those spaces for joy. And, you know, watching my kids read for school, I saw them kind of have the same experience that I did, where there were like the school books and you had to do all these things with them and take tests and write reports and annotate and all of that, which is important. And also that educators have to, I mean, you're held to curriculums and testing and all of those things. So that has to happen. But at the same time, there was like the reading on my own, that was the fun reading, and then the school reading. And how do we kind of combine that? And I think it's definitely about giving space to fall in love and have the agency and having those connections and having that independence. Because when I would lose myself in a book, in the world of a book, having that experience made me kind of chase that experience again, you know, and want that experience and search for where I could have that again, that sort of full immersion in the world of a story. And so if a kid never experiences that, whether they don't get the agency to kind of choose what they love to read, or just something is just never, oh, okay, I thought, something is never kind of connecting and working for them, you know, how can they first, separate from all of the stuff they're supposed to learn, just have that full, immersive, connected, independent experience with a book? Yeah.
Yeah, well said. I've never taught young kids, but I do have 2 young children in my home. I'm lucky that I think we're doing our best to foster. It sounds like the kinds of homes that you grew up in, with a lot of books and easy access. And my 3.5-year-old has definitely tried to return a library book to the librarian at the playground when she's seen her there with her daughter, so that we don't have to walk to the library. And I'm always interested in how much she wants to talk about story. And when we finish a book, she'll say, "So what happened in Bertram the Bad?" And I'll say, "I don't know. What do you think?" She'll say, "Can you guess?" You know, she wants me to tell the story again, even when we're not reading the book. And it's been my experience too, as well, at schools. I think the most, I do a lot of school visits, you know, a few dozen a year maybe. And it's usually my favorite moments of those is when they've organized some sort of contest, essay contest, or a writing, a project, maybe not a contest, but a project. And if you want to participate, you can, and you can get a pizza lunch with me. I wrote a book on the history of pizza, so it's often pizza. And that I'm always struck that the kids never really want to talk to me. They just want to talk to each other about the books that they're working on or the projects they're working on. I have to sort of insert myself into the conversation sometimes. So I think just like making space, giving access, making space is a thing that I try to do in my own life.
So I'm hoping you can comment on this moment in our nation's literacy landscape. What brings you joy and optimism about books, reading and literacy currently?
Somebody else start.
Well, for me, I think that we are, for what I do, I mostly make picture books. A lot of my picture books are labeled early readers, but they're take the form like Lucky Duck of a picture book. I think we are kind of in a golden age of picture books. I look at my contemporaries, my colleagues that are working on the things, and I'm just sort of flabbergasted at the audacity that they have in the risks that they'll take and the stories they'll tell and the artwork that they make. And I am always just feel like I'm trying to catch up to get to the level of some of the beautiful things that are being made. So for me, I just look at the books that are being made, and quite simply, I'm just inspired by that.
Well, maybe book talk is kind of a positive thing, because it's a way to kind of, it's for older kids certainly and teenagers, but I always think of this idea of social media kind of, we have to push that away because then kids won't read. And I'm certainly fighting the distraction myself, just like writing time and all the things that you can get distracted by online. But I also think, what are the ways that we can kind of combine these things? And one thing can kind of excite you to do the other. And so if there's, social media kind of communicating that books are cool and collecting books, the way any other collectible, and talking about how many of you read and that kind of excitement, maybe they can be combined in a really positive way, because it's not going away, and these can be used as social media can be used as tools. And so I think I see a lot of positivity there, even with the negative stuff.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm always just so happy and hopeful when in school visits or just library visits or just any opportunity to talk to kids, because during that Q&A portion, they are really excited about books and stories. And it's not even, or talking, like I'll talk to them about the stories in video games. I'll talk to them about stories that they don't like maybe they're reading something at school that they really don't like. And I could say oh, I didn't like that either. Or, oh, I actually really like that. And here's why. And I think kids really appreciate just that opportunity to talk about how they think, to know that what they think about stories is important, and to know, again, that they have a story, that they have a relationship with books and stories that has value and that can be sometimes challenging, sometimes joyful, but just always really, really powerful. And so when I'm talking to the actual kids themselves or engaging with them, I'm always hopeful and happy because they're excited about stories.
So I think a lot of kids look at authors and assume reading and writing are just second nature to you, and it's always been easy, and sort of hold you up on a pedestal. So I'm hoping you can share out some times where reading was a challenge for you. You struggled in your reading identity, or maybe there was a decline in your reading life, and how you might address some of those kids who are feeling that reluctance or resistance, as you may have felt at certain points of your life.
Well, I think for me, there were certain kinds of books that I was naturally attracted to and certain kinds that I wasn't. And I think that it was challenging for me sometimes to be kind of tested on reading material that just wasn't the way my brain worked well. It just would kind of go out of my head if I was reading just for the things and the tasks that I was supposed to be doing in school. So I think it was just challenging for me to absorb a lot of information that way. So there were times, or even though I had this disconnect because I was this reader at home, and at school, I was kind of hot and cold, or I could pay attention to certain things and not to others, or I did well in certain classes and not in others based on how connected I was to the book. So it wasn't that all kinds of reading or all kinds of writing came easily to me. But I remembered the positive experiences, and that kind of got me through the more challenging experiences, I think. And so just the more kind of positive reinforcement on the things that worked helped me get through the things that were harder.
Yeah, I think for me too, I struggled a bit when I was younger. I was not the strongest reader. And I was born in the late 1900s, which at the time was not the way that it is now. It wasn't always possible to walk into an elementary school library and see a graphic novel section. It just like wasn't the case. Maybe there would be some collected peanuts or something, which are great, but like it's not the way that it is now. And I specifically remember getting Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics at the grocery store. They sold them at the grocery store. And I think my mom bought me probably the first one to keep me quiet for 15 minutes. Single mom. We've all been there, kid in a grocery store, buy them something. And that was one of the first things that, I don't know if it's my interest in drawing but when I discovered comics, that was sort of like a big turning point for me as a reader. When I realized that there was all this other stuff out there that I just wasn't necessarily seeing at the public library or at the elementary schools that I went to. And I do think that I still struggled later. I mean, Chaucer in high school or Beowulf, they're all a lot of respect, but like they was hard to keep my interest at times. And it was reading a lot of comics. And I think it was like that they were my own. My mom wasn't interested in them. But there were certain adults who sort of would talk to me about them as if they were worthwhile. They weren't dismissive of them, which I think, kind of seems normal today. Comics are everywhere now. But for me, that was a big turning point.
I think I talk a lot about sort of the difference in my reading identity now and how many challenges I have as a reader because of distractions, because of social media, because of life, and how for a long time I felt shame because as a kid, I was such a big reader, and it was something I took a lot of pride in, and like being the kid who read like really thick books, and like I spent hours and hours reading and getting lost in books. And one very specific thing I do talk about is those comfort reads. And as a kid, I was a big rereader, and now I am. So when I feel myself needing to sort of get back into that reading self, I'll go back and read the books that I loved, even like childhood books that I loved, or just books that I've read over and over that kind of get me back into that habit and into that spirit. And so I talk to kids about it's okay to just keep rereading a book. You get new things every time. There's a new part of your relationship with that story that you get each time. And sometimes I see parents or caregivers at fairs or events where a child chooses a book that they either know or that the adult might say like, oh, you're too old for that, or you're out of that level, or you're past that. And I think that a lot of readers know the books that are going to make them feel comfortable and make them stay excited about reading. So I think it's okay to encourage that and to just say, okay, it's a story and there'll be more.
Well, as much as we could listen to you guys speak all day about your craft, your lives as readers, we do have to sadly end the panel, and we are so grateful for your time today and for your contributions to the lives of readers of all ages. So thank you so much for being here and for your work.